Up next, we have the adrenal glands, which sit just superior to the kidneys. And then we'll also talk about the pineal gland in this section as well. So 18-6 is just the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland are kind of these like little tiny hats that sit just on top of the kidneys on both sides. And they'll have a cortex, which means bark. So that's always going to be the surrounding portion. And then they'll also have a medulla, which is going to be that inside portion. So adrenal medulla, adrenal cortex, respectively. And the reason why we identify the separation between these two is that they have very different functions and very different cells. In the cortex, we'll be making corticosteroids, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. And here in this picture here on the right from your book, you can see that the majority of the cells are spanning the width of the adrenal cortex, and that's a much thicker region, versus the adrenal medulla is a much smaller region. And the medulla, if you remember from the hypothalamus section, actually is what's connected directly to the hypothalamus. Excuse me, to the posterior pituitary, connected directly to the posterior pituitary with neurons. So those postganglionic neurons. And so that should tell you about what's being produced in the medulla. That's going to be just epinephrine and norepinephrine. So now the cortex, we can focus on the cortex. The cortex has 4 different layers, which you'll need to be able to identify under a scope. The adrenal capsule is really easy to tell. It's just kind of this like wispy, like pieces that you don't really see having any meaning to on the slide. And then there's a really big chunk in the center, which I think is the easiest to identify, and that's the zona fasciculata. And the zona fasciculata, as you can tell in the picture here on the left, it's pretty sparse. It's pretty clear. There's a couple cells here and there, but it's the thickest portion of the adrenal cortex. And this is actually where we're making cortisol. Goodness, sorry. And then that just superficial to the zona fasciculata, you'll have the zona glomerulosa, and glomerulosa referring to glomerulus, and the glomerulus is a really dense structure, and so this you can tell is the glomerulosa because it has really dense dots, and right there is where we'll be making aldosterone, which is really important for our RAS system, or the renin aldosterone angiotensin system. And then most deep in the adrenal cortex, you have the zona reticularis, and you can tell the difference between the reticularis and the fasciculata because the reticularis has these like wispy, long, empty spaces, and then that's where we're actually making the androgens. So things like things that are sex hormone related. Whenever we are talking about the adrenal medulla, what's the whole purpose of having epinephrine and norepinephrine coming from the adrenal medulla? Well, it's an easy place to direct the rest of the digestive system to mobilize glucose if needed. It can also tell the skeletal system to mobilize glucose. It can also tell the adipose tissue to mobilize glucose and fats and lipids for energy storage, for energy purposes. It can also go to the liver and tell the liver to make glucose available for energy. And then it can also tell the heart to stimulate contractions, but we don't talk about that as much in this course. All right, that's it for the adrenal glands. Next up is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a very small, tiny little nub in the posterior aspect of the hypothalamus and thalamus region, just inferior to the end of the corpus callosum. And the pineal gland is responsible for coordinating our circadian rhythm. And what our circadian rhythm is a method for us as humans to identify the difference between day and night and when we're supposed to sleep. So this is really coordinating our sleep cycles, our wake and sleep cycles, which is really important for a lot of other downstream processes like metabolism and stress and brain functionality all in general. And it's interesting because it has such an important role for our day-to-day, but it's not a very well studied or very well understood gland in the body in general. So we have a picture of it over here to the right. I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about it for histology purposes. It looks very different from the rest of the structures that we've learned for histology. And the way this works is it has a hormone called melatonin. You might remember from the anterior pituitary gland that it releases melanocyte stimulating hormone, and then that would actually go to the pineal gland and encourage it to make melatonin. And melatonin is going to be released during the night, and that will actually help us induce a state of sleep. So this is why if you're having sleep problems, your physician might actually recommend for you to take melatonin to help you kind of reset your circadian rhythm and encourage you to fall asleep. But the problem is that this is not a very like one and done kind of deal. You really have to do it for weeks on end, and you have to be really, really consistent before the pineal gland really kicks in and starts to act differently. It's also really important for reproductive pathways, but we don't talk about it too much in this course. But essentially can really inhibit some reproductive hormones from working the normal way that they're supposed to. And the pineal gland in humans, other than the sleep-wake cycle, is important, but for other animals, the pineal gland is super, super important because it regulates when they are available for reproduction. So for instance, I don't know enough about like sheep or cows, but they only are sexually active during a season, and that season may have more or less light during the day, and so that might mean that they make more or less melatonin at night, depending on the time of day, and that will actually regulate whether or not they're producing the right hormones so that they can release their egg and sperm, so that they can actually promote having some sort of fertilization if that does happen. So the pineal gland is super, super important for those species that only reproduce once a year, or that they're seasonal breeders. For us, it's not as important because we are able to reproduce at any time. Well, I shouldn't say at any time during the year, but during any of the months out of the year. So this is why it's not studied as closely as some of the other portions of the human body. But it's super interesting. If you're interested to learn more about the pineal gland, we can definitely talk more one-on-one. It's a weird little thing. It's a weird little gland. That's all I have for this section.